Jamestown, Virginia, arose as the first permanent English settlement in the New World, largely thanks to the strength and resilience of the Jamestown colony brides. The initial group of settlers, all male, arrived and built James Fort in 1607, a private, corporate adventure. Much opportunity, along with much risk, lay waiting in the New World. But within a year, the men already complained about the lack of female company. To satisfy the colonial men, the Virginia Company sent over the bride ships of 1619, enticing the women with hopes for a better life while satiating the men's demands. 90 women were selected that year, with a smaller group chosen and sent out several years later, commonly referred to as the Tobacco Brides of Jamestown. Similar to the casket girls who settled in Louisiana in the 18th century, these women gained new rights and freedoms that Europe kept out of their reach. Despite how pop culture commonly depicts them, Jamestown colony women married who they liked, and many actually owned property of their own, something unheard of in Europe. While life was definitely not easy for them, the women of Jamestown were instrumental in creating new lives and new opportunities for the future women of colonial America. Female arrivals to Jamestown were not forced to wed. The Sky television series, Jamestown, is only the latest to spread and encourage the false rumor that the women who arrived aboard 2 ships from England to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 were bought and paid for by male colonists. Some accounts, including in the Jamestown TV series, make the claim that women were forced to marry whomever paid for them and subjected to disrespect and abuse. None of this is true. The Virginia Company of London, who owned and managed the Virginia colony at the time, began a brief recruitment effort in 1618, advertising in England for women to apply for a sponsored immigration to the fledgling colony. Men in Virginia were encouraged to help financially sponsor one of the successful applicants. However, neither the women in England nor the men in Virginia were in communication with one another, signed no agreements, and none of the women were required to wed any of the colonial men. In fact, upon arrival to the colony, each woman joined an already established family. This provided her the privacy and security needed as she began her new life, as well as time to get to know the men before making her own decision as to who, or if, she married. It is important to recognize the professionalism and courtesy extended by the Virginia Company of London in this specific incident, since they could have quite easily forced women to wed the Virginia settlers. At the time, the world saw women as property, and the numerous instances of women kidnapped and sold to Virginia shows that they probably could have done it without much hassle. The 1619 brides were not the first women in Virginia by a long shot. While definitely true that a shortage of women in the Jamestown colony plagued the young settlement for years, the women who arrived on the bride ships were hardly the first ladies to join. Women began immigrating to Virginia from England in 1608, and a comparably large number of women were aboard the 5-ship fleet of the famous Third Supply of that same year. One woman, Anne Burroughs, married carpenter John Layden 3 months after she landed in Jamestown, becoming the first marriage in the colony. The owners of the Virginia Company, as well as the early colonial leaders, believed more permanent female settlers would encourage social and cultural stability in the colony. Men would be more likely to stay in Virginia if they had a wife and family. Like all important guests, women arrived late to the party. Let's face it, recruiting anyone at all to leave hearth and home for the wilds of Virginia proved a hard sell. At the same time the Virginia Company promoted their colonial venture, people returned from Jamestown to report life in the New World was a complete nightmare. The decision to cross the Atlantic only to deal with a strange land with unfamiliar and understandably angry peoples was a little easier for men to make, since society encouraged men to seek adventure and take risks. Furthermore, men, unlike women, required no personal protector to simply exist in the world without being harassed. These facts in mind, immigration to Virginia appealed even less to many women. Even by 1619, few European females existed in Jamestown and the surrounding area. There were a great many American tribal women, of course, but colonial officials frowned on men taking wives among them. Pocahontas, who married an Englishman in the early years of the colony, stood out as an exception. And yet, both officials and the male colonists themselves knew in order to develop a permanent settlement in the New World, both men and women were needed. Viewed as a powerful civilizing force, women undertook the familial and household tasks men found demeaning. Even though the 1619 brides were free to marry, or not, they were treated as the precious commodity that they absolutely were. Once the sale was made, the brides needed to pass a rigorous application process. Shareholders in the Virginia Company knew they needed to sweeten the deal in order to recruit the kinds of women they desired for settlement in their Jamestown colony. Socially acceptable women from stable backgrounds were highly unlikely to embark for Virginia on a whim. Therefore, an advertisement appeared in London newspapers and plastered on the walls of buildings, asking for women of good family and reputation to apply for resettlement in Virginia. As the idea was pitched, it became the Christian, specifically the Protestant, thing to do. Save the New World from the Spanish papists. Convert the heathen natives. Also, each and every successful candidate would become mistress of her own household, after marriage to a male colonist, with her own gardens and grounds to tend. Even today that sounds like a pretty good deal. But in the early 17th century, to an Englishwoman of even moderate means, it had the ring of a brilliant dream come true. Almost all of the land in England was owned by royal or noble persons, and any woman who managed to marry a man who could provide her with a spacious home and gardens was fortunate indeed. And along came the Virginia Company guaranteeing the same. Why scrub floors and chamber pots the rest of your life when you can be a gentlewoman in Virginia? The competition was fairly keen. Even a quick perusal of the applications, which were discovered in England in recent decades, reveals the women did their utmost to showcase themselves, their backgrounds, skills and intentions. This tells a great deal more about the lack of opportunities in their homeland than any desire to relocate halfway across the world. Older women versus younger. The skills they offered. Some things are ever the same, no matter time or place. The women who applied to become brides to Jamestown knew exactly how to pitch themselves to the Virginia Company, depending on their age. According to David R. Ransom's article, Wives for Virginia, 1,621 inches, the William and Mary Quarterly, 48:1, 3-18. The female applicants' ages ranged from 15 to 28. Yes, in 1618, 15 was considered marriageable age. The 28-year-olds actually pushed into old age, believe it or not. A rundown of their claimed skills is very telling of the value of youth and beauty versus age and experience. The 14 to 16 crowd boasted of gold and silver lace-making skills. While no woman left a record stating her reasons, it may well have been that the youngest ladies knew they would be in highest demand among the Jamestown grooms, which in turn would mean the most rich and powerful men picked first from the youngest, freshest ladies. What other sort of colonist would desire lace-making skills in a wife? Only the very rich, that's who. Some brides may have tried to escape ship before departure. While this is only a theory, it stands to reason at least some of the women who boarded the ship Marmaduke to Virginia became frightened and angry when the discovery was made that none of the supplies promised them were on board, Zug 91, and O'Neill 234 to 235. In other words, all but 2 of the women would arrive in Virginia with nothing but the clothes on their backs. 2 of the women brought along small bags, similar to what we would call a carry-on today. Virginia Company records suggest there was at least some protestation from the women before departure. After the Marmaduke left port, the Virginia Company wrote a letter to the Colonial Council in Jamestown, knowing full well the ship with the women and no supplies would arrive ahead of the letter. Apologizing for not following through with their promise to outfit the women in their new lives, we had no means to put provisions aboard. O'Neill 234 to 235. What we do know is that all who boarded arrived in Jamestown 6 weeks later. The question remains, did they stay aboard willingly? And if so, did shame keep them there? What would it have been like to return home after the discovery of such an important promise? All the praise, the celebratory send-offs, the boasting that was undoubtedly done. Who would return home after that? Earlier efforts to attract decent women were miserable failures. As mentioned earlier in this story, women began arriving in Jamestown as early as 1608. The first woman, a Mistress Forrest, who came to settle in Virginia with her husband, brought along her maid, Anne Burris, who was courted and feted by all the men of Jamestown and married soon thereafter. Over the next year more women arrived. The colony was already begging the Virginia Company to do something about the dearth of females. The trouble was, few people, male or female, wanted to go to Virginia. It was viewed as a dangerous wilderness where people went to die. So, the company began rounding up some of the innumerable street people of London, and taking on convicted criminals housed in Newgate and the Old Bailey prisons. Transportation to Virginia became a very common method of punishment, a choice to prisoners that proved to be wildly popular over the alternative, death. Therefore, most of the female arrivals to Virginia in the earliest years were not the sort of women colonists wished to marry. Indeed, a colonial official wrote to the Virginia Company, despairing that the women who were being sent were of such low quality that if the company could do no better, they shouldn't bother at all. Truly, colonials might be second-class citizens with no women around, but even they had standards. Some brides did not season well, or died in the famous 1622 massacre. Scholars and researchers remain baffled as to exactly why so many new arrivals to Virginia died quickly, sometimes in days, more often weeks or months. If one survived a full year in the New World, one was considered seasoned. Barring disease, attacks from local tribes, or, in the case of women, a difficult childbirth, one could expect to live to a respectable old age, which could range anywhere between 35 and 80. This included the women of the 1619 bride ships. Some survived, thrived, and have living descendants today. Others faded away within a year or so. At least one of them may have perished in the 1622 Powhatan Uprising, also known as the 1622 Massacre, when members of the Powhatan Nation attacked the English settlements, killing nearly two-thirds of the European population. Colonial women of Virginia established traits of power and expectations in their female descendants. Their rarity gave Virginia women powers they never would have held back home in Europe. They were special, and they knew it. The male colonists shared the same low survival rate as the women, so it was typical for a woman to become a well-off widow before she was out of her teens. Widows wielded great personal and financial power in the American colonies as long as they did not remarry. Even then, the Virginia colonial court record is replete with married women coming before judges on their own, which was against the law of coverture, which made a married woman civilly dead. In other words, even if she was raped, it was her husband or father who sued the rapist for damaging his property. In 17th century Virginia, those rules did not always apply, largely due to how highly women were valued. Not all women wielded self-autonomy, but Virginia women, single, widowed, and married, could inherit property and sell property as well as defend themselves in court cases. For the times, that was a very big deal. They were apparently particularly fond of bringing court cases for the most minor of incidents. Virginia women were also notorious for suing their enemies for defamation of character. They certainly knew how to stand up for themselves and seldom hesitated to do so if the opportunity was there. Even 2 centuries later, European visitors to Virginia remarked on how fiercely independent and even spoiled were the women of the Old Dominion.